Hello, Booktube. This is 12 days of LitMas video. It was a project created by Strict Cover Lit, and it's the 6th day, and it's my story with literature. Very interesting. There's been some very challenging prompts to this project. Flash fiction, haiku, things that have really made me think. But this one may be the toughest. When you get to a certain age, I've been reading pretty regularly, probably for almost 50 years, maybe slightly longer. So it's a half century. Some years tons and tons of books, some years less. Depending on where I was in my life, what I was doing. And when you try to remember what the most influential parts of that story are, it can be a bit difficult. So I thought I'd start without rambling on like fellows my age do sometimes. But I thought I'd ramble a little bit. And I thought I'd try to give a coherence to the story that perhaps it doesn't deserve. I started reading before kindergarten, but obviously it would have been of a limited nature, but influential. I grew up on a very small hill farm in Vermont. We didn't have a lot of children's books, but there were some. I remember starting to read when I associated the picture of the boat with the B-O-A-T below it, like many people do, and being excited. And then we didn't really have the age categories of literature then that you do now. I remember being little and watching The Wonderful World of Disney. Then I got a box set, which I still have, a set of the golden books about Disney, about nature, and about, of course, everything from Mary Poppins to the cartoons. That was very influential. And then when I got a little bit older, Treasure Island and Kidnapped and things like Poe's The Cask of Amontillado and The Raven and Mark Twain's Huckleberry Finn and Tom Sawyer. And for me, especially Tom Sawyer, I wasn't a literary critic, I was a little boy reading. Ivanhoe by Scott. And we were in school and we would get a little more. The Man in the Iron Mask, The Hunchback of Notre Dame, Howard Pyle's books about pirates and knights, King Arthur and his Round Table. So fairly standard with an adventure twist. Books would be marketed to boys or to girls. And I read a lot of the ones that were marketed to little boys. Eventually worked my way into thrillers like Hammond Innes, Alistair MacLean. These are things my dad would leave around. Definitely with a British leaning on the publications. And on the American side, it would be Westerns. Zane Grey, Max Brand, Louis L'Amour. And so these sort of things. And when I was younger, the popular novels were things like Irving Wallace. So you just would grab them as you could. As a boy, I didn't get to go to bookstores very often. I can't really remember any time with my parents. But when we moved from Vermont to a bigger town for my father to go to graduate school, the town had, I believe, 4 used bookstores. And it was a moderately sized town of about 40,000 people now. I think it probably had less then. Maybe it had more, I don't know. But used bookstores were fairly common. We had a couple of new bookstores, but I would go into the used bookstores, and usually an old guy in there with cats or something, and he'd wander stacks. And when I say stacks, I mean stacks. They were leaning everywhere, and they were a treasure trove. Discovered Edgar Rice Burroughs, Rider Haggard, Arthur Conan Doyle. So you would, and you could, if the guy in there would talk to you, and it was almost always the guy, at least in the town I was in, usually with a beard, and he's more busy talking to his friends than he was going to talk to a little boy. You would discover things. I remember Alfred Hitchcock and Three Investigators and their little fort underneath the garbage pile type of thing. And there was the Hardy Boys and all that sort of thing. And then it would have been about 1972, two things happened. One, excuse me, a neighbor gave me The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings in paperback. And that changed everything. I was just gone to another land. And not many people knew about him then, at least not where I lived. And he was from another place, a bigger place, going to school with my father. And then at about the same time, another guy gave me a whole box of vintage science fiction that I wish I still had, because they were in immaculate condition. And there were some great ones. Andre Norton, the Lucky Star novels by Asimov, Clifford D. Simak, Poole Anderson, the Robert Heinlein juveniles. Then it took off. It took off. I became really interested in science fiction. I had been watching Star Trek since it came out. Started seeing indications that something called Star Wars was on its way. Got Starlog magazine from its first issue. I'd already been picking up piles and piles of used pulp magazines. Galaxy, Amazing Stories, Analog, which was a later incarnation, and then all these sorts of things. So, and I had piles of them. Some of them I would love to still have because the covers were wonderful. And then, so all those years watching Star Trek, and then Star Wars came out, and then a lot of short stories in the magazines, some of the ace doubles for paperbacks. Once high school's over, I went in the Coast Guard, and at sea we all read a lot. And after that, I was in isolated duty stations in the Pacific Northwest, and we read even more. And we traded books back and forth. There's the Executioner series about like a vigilante guy. There was Nick Carter, tons of these books. We went through Louis L'Amour like you wouldn't believe. And more Alistair MacLean, Hammond Innes, the standards. A little more sophisticated John le Carré would come along. Len Deighton, Wilbur Smith. So it tended towards the thrillers and the sci-fi. I stayed pretty true to that, but I read a lot of books on the sea, on the ocean. Read a lot of science books because it was related to my profession at the time, and I was just curious about it. And of course, you read Asimov, you end up curious about everything to do with science. And then later on, it was a college degree. Ended up opening a couple of short-lived used bookstores. Worked for bigger bookstore for a while. And then 3 graduate degrees later, I ended up a librarian. And of course, I read all the history and all that sort of stuff that went with those degrees. And I sort of lost track a little bit of some of the books that and the authors that had instilled the love of reading in me. I went for the classics. I went for the nonfiction heavily for years and years and years. And just this year, I decided to start returning to some of those roots a little bit and start looking at some of the things that have happened in those genres that I originally loved since I stopped reading them so much. So I've been out of the loop with the newer science fiction, the newer fantasy, the newer thriller writers. I mean, occasionally I do them along the way for a vacation or something, but I haven't spent as much time with them. One funny thing is some of the big names now that I am reading, I'm saying, well, he sounds just like Lester Del Rey, or I've read this kind of story before. It doesn't seem quite as fresh sometimes to me as it gets credit for. But I do find new voices and exciting new stuff. And so thus far, hopefully I get another 50 plus years of reading. So that is my literary journey. And Booktube is the newest part of it. Thank you, Booktube.